Desire wakes us up and is electrifying. It can be very unsettling and daunting to let yourself feel an appetite for life.
Well, no one ever really asks us, like, what do we really desire? It's not a question we put to us very often.
If you kind of mute your desires, then it's a life of quiet desperation a lot of the time. It's really amazing to think about the aliveness that comes with desire. And yet, if we are just at the mercy of desire, then it can be the thing that blows up your life as well. It can be incredibly harmful.
Welcome to the Authentic Man podcast. I am your host, David Chambers. This is a podcast for men who want more and less from life. More deep connection, more emotional intelligence, more self-awareness, and more great sex. And less heartache, less conflict, less overthinking, and less stress. Creating dating lives, sex lives, and relationships that are incredible and authentic. My deepest goal is that you, the listener, can take away what you hear in this podcast and apply it to your life so that you can experience greater happiness, transformational growth, deeper relationships, and profound sexual intimacy. I believe that as men, we are capable of so much more depth than we are shown or led to believe. So join me as we get deep into this. Welcome back to another episode of the Authentic Man podcast. I'm your host, David Chambers. I'm a men's dating, relationship and intimacy coach, guiding men to deeper experiences of themselves and deeper experiences of relationships and love and intimacy. And today, I have a wonderful guest with me, a woman who is an absolute expert in desire. She's been studying desire. She's written books about desire. And as you'll come to realize, when you think of desire, what do you think of? You probably think of sexual desire. You probably think of maybe desire for power or desire for particular outcomes or attention. And we actually cover all of those things. And we actually talk about what is a desire and what that kind of spans as well. And we talk a lot about, taboo desires, really get into desires around power as well and empowerment and the difference that we feel when we hear those different words in there as well. And we talk about the differences in sexual desire and sexual desire for men and women, and our desire to be wanted and desire to be desired as well. That's a lovely part of the conversation, the desire to be desired, and how our desires can come from our childhood experiences and childhood lacks. And as well as we touch on two bits that are highly related to desire, which is disappointment and also bitterness. And Charlotte has a really funny and beautiful way to look at bitterness. I had never thought of bitterness is such a positive as she brings, and it's a wonderful conversation where we just weave and dive, and it's a conversation between two people talking about desire, and one of those people is an expert and the other is me. So I hope you really enjoy this episode. Really enjoy it. If you're some of the topics in here, I talk about men and being in a relationship, struggling with sexual desire and struggling to create intimacy in a relationship is something I'm working with quite a lot with men. And if that's something that's, present for you or is occurring to you or a friend even, feel free to reach out. Let me know. I'm taking on probably one more client in the next couple of months. So that could be you if you reach out fast enough. But without further ado, I'll let you get into the episode. So hello listeners. Today I have a guest with me who talks about a subject which is, I think, fascinating to us all, as something that we don't really think about. It's so intrinsic to our life that we don't really think about the deeper roots that's underneath these things that I'm speaking about. I'm trying not to say the word, but I'm going to say the word. There's desire, we don't always consider our desires. We just kind of flow with them. We follow them, or we reject them, or we suppress them, and all the things in between. And I was lucky enough to be on a fantastic panel conversation around sex, love, and intimacy, if I remember rightly. It was this wonderful woman who has such an intricate knowledge and understanding of desire and so much wonderful experience. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. Hey, how are you doing today, Charlotte?
That is such a wonderfully generous introduction. So much to live up to. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here and that you have been patient and understanding and making this happen.
No problem. Like I said, it's my pleasure to have you on. I think it'd be really interesting to hear. I don't think we talked about this on the panel. Is actually what your journey was to do the work you do now, and to bring you to the focus of desire.
I've always been quite restless, which doesn't sound like it would go hand in hand with becoming a psychotherapist, where you're supposed to be very patient. I felt quite agitated as a child, and still do a lot of the time, and I would get frustrated by the experience of being in therapy. And I started having therapy when I was 6, which might sound very shockingly young to some. I felt incredibly anxious after having heart surgery when I was 4.5, and therapy was kind of a punishment. It felt like a punishment. My parents didn't mean it that way, but I couldn't bear the therapist. And I think it was the most frustrating experience, and yet it kind of galvanized me to want something more from it. But I often thought, why isn't this therapist asking me what I would really like out of life, or what matters to me? Those questions just didn't come up, and then I felt too awkward to bring them up. And I found that in my work as a therapist, kind of using some of my restlessness and impatience actually could be effective. Like, let's get a move on. What is it that you would like out of your life that isn't happening? And sometimes people have the most extraordinary responses to those questions, and it really energizes something
in them. I guess for a lot of people, no one ever really asks us, like, what do we really desire? It's not a question people put to us very often.
No, and it is one of the joys of being a psychotherapist, that you can ask really bold, inquisitive things that would not necessarily be appropriate in a social setting, and you can go deep and dark, and it doesn't have to be a kind of pleasant conversation. Even it could be disturbing, it could be uncomfortable, and that's survivable, and it can be transformative. So I probably sound quite ghoulish putting it that way, which I am.
And I think it's one of the things I loved about when you were on the panel talk and you talked about desire, and you talked about the kind of the people, a lot about dark desire. I remember you bringing that up, and I remember thinking, oh yeah, of course, we have these dark desires that we don't always acknowledge, and we don't always want to speak to people. We don't go into a cocktail party and go, what is it you really want from life? And people go, well, really, I'd really love to stab my mother in the throat, actually, for the way that she treated me as a child.
Right. Yeah. And I'm feeling incredibly threatened by this person who I'm competitive with, even though we're having a child together and we are married. And, like the truth about how we can want destructive things and things that we're not supposed to want. And we often don't want the things we're supposed to want.
Yes.
As well.
And to play that through my mind, we often don't want the things we're supposed to want.
Right. The appropriate things, like sexual desire in married dynamics, or wanting to be a parent when you are a parent. Like it's not always completely aligned with societal norms.
Yeah. And I'd love to start off, and I imagine you get this question so often, but I think it's always good to, what is desire? What is the definition of desire?
Desire actually comes from the fallen stars. So there is a sense of kind of space and longing. And if you look at the Latin etymology of the word itself, it that's not really an answer to your question, though. It's more of an interesting history of the word. I think desire is a kind of motion and sense of possibility, and it can be an immediate desire. It can be a big long-term desire. I don't really like the kind of cognitive boring distinctions. Yes, I sound quite judgmental to put it that way, but there are so many. I got really inundated. There's so many academic discussions about the difference between desiring and wanting and yearning. And actually, I found that it was kind of a detour into obsessive ruminating for me. And I think that desire is about something you don't have. And there's that space of longing.
Mm-hmm.
So I use the words interchangeably as well. Wanting, yearning, lusting, slightly different, questing. I mean, I like all the words for it.
Okay, so it's like the space between what we have and having what we want. That space is desire. That is the space of desire?
Yes, there's a kind of stirring. Desire is never static in a way. So, and if this is sounding shape-shifting, it kind of is. It's actually really hard to pin down, because as soon as you have it, even conceptually, you no longer have desire for that exactly. You desire a glass of water, a word I always say in a weird water. How do you say water? If you desire that glass of water, when you have it, where does the desire go? Is it still desire that you feel, or it's something different? So it's always moving. It's always in motion.
Yeah, so it's kind of this elusive thing. We desire something, and use the example of glass of water is wonderful. And I was like, oh yeah, I have a glass of water. I want some water.
It made me thirsty also talking about it.
Yeah, and I have my water, and I don't.
Also one of life's miracles.
I don't desire it anymore because I have it, or I've had it, and then that desire is disappeared into
Where is it?
something else. It's transmuted into some other feeling of maybe satisfaction at that point, and then my desire then moves to something else.
Yes, that is what happens. And we're only satisfied for brief periods of time, which is the thing that is so easy to forget. So in the small ways and the big ways, if you think you desire a big wedding, and that's a classic one that we've been socialized to desire and believe will lead to fulfillment, and then you have the wedding, and then what happens next? There's always a kind of agitation that occurs after, and we're on to the next thing. And I think that can, of course, get us into trouble, and especially if we don't expect it, especially if we think, no, that's the only thing I desire, and then I'll be satisfied at the end. No, it's not gonna work that way.
And it's interesting you say that, because I was having a conversation with my clients recently, and he was talking about, he was like, oh, if I'm making this amount of money, then I'm going to be happy, and then my life can come together. And I kind of said to him, I was like, you're lying to yourself. And he was like, what do you mean? I was like, because you'll get that, and then you'll be like, I want another thing. Then the next thing will be the thing that makes me happy.
Yeah. Completely. So I like the stars as a concept, and the fact that the word desire comes from the stars, because you gaze at the stars, but you never get there, and you can keep on looking. And I think it's great to have a kind of direction of travel, but if you think that you're going to arrive and settle and then be there and that's it, like fulfillment, the end, it's not realistic.
And it kind of makes me, hearing this, is you imagine why so many religions are, shall we say, quite suppressive of desire, because it's never quenched. It's never, your desire is never complete. It's this everlasting, like lusting for, desiring, wanting, needing, yearning. Desire almost creates a sensation and feeling of emptiness.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, and I like etymology in general. Wanting is kind of such an interesting double meaning word, because it's also, she's in wanting of that. It's both a longing to have, but it's also about deprivation and lacking. So it goes both ways. But there's always that emptiness that we are up against, I think. And I think that in our kind of consumerist culture, there's a belief that there'll be enoughness and that there'll be a kind of, which is great in a way, that we've gotten to the point of not wanting to just always want more and more and more and more. But I also think that enoughness is an ideal, and we've got to kind of embrace the fact that we rarely do have enough of everything we want. Which, do I sound like a downer to put it that way? That we actually usually end up feeling kind of deprived in some way, but that's okay. We can deal with that.
Yeah, and I guess I'm just thinking of this, that we have desire, but we also have an urge to fulfill those desires, don't we? You know, like this is a thing that I see, and I work a lot with men in the space of like relationships and in intimacy. We have desire, and we think we need to fulfill the desire because we have it. But that's not actually the case.
Yes, I mean, it's very action-oriented. It feels, desire, when it grabs hold, it feels almost urgent. It feels like an emergency sometimes, which it can lead to affairs. It can lead to doing all sorts of things in the name of passion. And it can feel so kind of vital and core that I think there's something about it that can be really difficult to ignore, and yet it freaks us out. So what you were saying about religion is so true, because it gets us into trouble. It's threatening and unsettling. I love it. I mean, I think it's wonderful to explore and think about. Of course, it can go in all sorts of catastrophic directions, and if you shut it down, that's a different kind of tragedy. And if you kind of mute your desires, then it's a life of quiet desperation a lot of the time. So kind of finding that balance and adjusting the temperature is a work in progress that's wonderful and worthwhile for everyone, yeah. I think.
So is it like we need to balance in life? There's a balance to be had between being with unmet desire and fulfilling on desire as well, for us to feel a level of contentment?
Well, so I mean, I'm going to go back to the star metaphor. There's a really great James Thurber story about a moth, and the moth is just focused on looking at the stars, and all the other moths think that he's ridiculous, because why is he kind of insisting on looking at the stars? And then they die burning in a lamp. And this other moth he dies trying to get to the stars, but he's kind of in motion and in pursuit. And there's something about that feels important. Like, not that you want to kind of be deluded and believe that you are destined to get everything you want, but kind of aiming for something while knowing that you're not going to get there. There is no there. Like you don't want to live your life just circling a lamp as a moth. And I think a lot of people can do that, sadly. I mean, I've certainly had time periods of doing that to myself, of just thinking, no, just stay in the lamp zone.
Like playing small.
So, yeah, playing small and being kind of intimidated by the concept of dreaming and wanting, because it's unsettling. It can be very unsettling and daunting to let yourself feel an appetite for life, because you might not get it, or you might get something and then lose it, and it makes us vulnerable. So desire is also, it's something we seek, but we're ambivalent about it.
So we have, do you find with in your work that people have quite a complex relationship to their desires?
People absolutely have strange and extraordinary relationships with desire. So, I mean, there can be a kind of wake up that happens in a crisis. And it might be let's say it's infidelity. I prefer the word infidelity to other ways of describing it. But there's this kind of schism that occurs, like if it's prompted by sexual desire, and it might be about bigger issues, of course, but it might be about attraction and lust for a particular person that feels so difficult to ignore and so important to honor in some way that it's almost as if it's a religious calling. Like it would be wrong not to do something. Like it's kind of renewed fidelity to life itself. It feels so visceral and almost kind of soulful. And I think it's really amazing to think about the aliveness that comes with desire when we're not kind of moralistic and judgmental about it.
Because I've actually heard that from clients before who have been, God, for some reason I can't find it, been in infidelity, extra affairs and extramarital relationships. And they felt, as to kind of described it, as a aliveness, like it really woke them up, you know? They really woke them up to, as, you know, a lot of the men I work with, they'll describe it as like, you know, I was living life in grayscale, you know? And they met someone, they had an extramarital affair or whatever you want to call it, something outside of the agreement of their relationship they were currently in. And they woke up to an aliveness in themselves, emotions, feelings, physical sensations, a possibility for lovemaking and sex, and even start to see the world in brighter colors and seeing more leaves and trees because of just what that created inside of them.
Totally. I mean, it's limerence, and the birds are singing, the air feels different, and everything about just existing is almost miraculous when there is that feeling of enthrallment. And I think there can be a realization of kind of how dead you were, like how everything had fallen asleep or become static in some way. So I think that desire wakes us up and is electrifying. And yet, if we are just at the mercy of desire and don't think about it, then it can be the thing that blows up your life as well. Like it can be incredibly harmful, and it's worth exploring all of these things and having insight about it and making space for it. But that's something that we're not always comfortable doing because we don't know where to go or who to talk to at those moments. And it can be hard to make healthy choices in those bigger consequential ways.
Because I'm thinking of
But it's interesting that we both tripped over the word. The word, I mean, part of it is like unfaithful. Like, let's say she was unfaithful. Like, unfaithful is a really interesting word to use to describe having sex with someone else, because it might actually feel faithful to life, to her sense of her own realized values. Or, I mean, it's already judgmental to say unfaithful or infidelity, like, or cheated. It's hard. It's hard to talk about desire betrayal without sounding judgmental, which is why I think sometimes people don't talk about it. They just do.
Yeah, and it's the, infidelity, cheating, the language we have around. And plus you add in the fact that, people are in relationship and they're in monogamous relationships or relationships where there's some agreement around some sort of sexual contact with others. And because of the judgment around cheating, infidelity, affairs, that even stops people from exploring the ideas of the desire that they have outside of the relationship. This has always really fascinated me. And I imagine it's a space that you've worked in a lot, where we have desire. It's a very normal thing. And I'm always saying this to the men that I work with. It's very normal for you to desire other people and other things that you don't have. What we do with it is a very different topic. But that judgment creates this really uncomfortable space for people, all humans, I imagine, where it's like, I desire, I desire another woman that's not my partner. And what do I do with that? Because I feel shame about expressing it. And it's not the part of my relationship. And it's a kind of gray area for people. Some people see just having desire as cheating in itself.
Yeah. Yes. And so it just becomes this sectioned off banned thing. And it's really stigmatized. I think it's still, for all of the talk about mental health destigmatizing, I think that infidelity, for lack of a better word, is still really stigmatized as an issue. It's pretty frowned upon. And then it also, it can also require so much more justification and defensiveness as well. Like, if people then feel that they have to double down and kind of explain why it's not just an affair and why, it needs to somehow be explained away, when actually human beings do not have all of life figured out, and relationships are difficult, and desire is a complicated subject. So it's great when people can be curious about it and look at what it may be about and what they want to what they want to get out of it. Sounds transactional. There's some agency as well. Like, if you are feeling desire for something, it can be a signal that is helpful and illuminating, and there are different options for what you do with it.
Yeah.
But I think we also would do well to kind of talk about the taboo desires more in general, because it would permit the different range of longing. So the fact that desire is supposed to just be desire for sex, like that in itself is already kind of narrowing. And
from the work, you've written a whole book that talks about the many, many types of desire, right? What are the kind of common taboo desires that we have as people that that are taboo?
Like, the desire for attention is so universal but so difficult to admit to past childhood. So I liked it when my younger child at the age of 3 said, I want attention. He said it to me, and I was able to give him attention. And I disappoint him at other moments for not giving him enough attention, but we could talk about it. It's so hard with adults. Like, don't make a fuss over my birthday. Oh, I don't, no, I'm so mortified. And then, like, it's a disaster, actually, because no one has made a fuss. We give so many mixed messages about attention and whether it's okay to care about attention, to receive attention. We all want attention. And that might be private, or it might be egomaniacal. Like it can be displayed in all sorts of embarrassing ways, but as a desire, it's perfectly noble. And I don't know why we can't kind of get comfortable with it. I would like to. I'd love to be able. I tried to actually be honest about my wish for desire for a big birthday last year. I was probably really annoying about it to my family and friends, but I just didn't want to hide from it. I wanted to make a thing of it. But I'd love to be able to talk about it with people more and kind of get them to admit that they actually want attention. That's my own desire. I think it's hard for people to admit the desire for desire, and that people want to be desired, they want to be wanted, and there can be something narcissistic feeling about that, and yet universal. So it's okay to want to be wanted. I don't personally think that there's any desire that is just so odious it shouldn't exist. Like I don't think any desire is a bad thing. I think it can be disturbing if it's the desire to hurt. And aggression is part of desire, and that is the taboo zone. And it might be inward as well. It can be the desire to be treated badly or to kind of be punished. Like there can be a lot of ways that it is destructive. And the desire for power is hard for people to talk about in a very open way. So maybe at certain moments of empowerment, I really find it interesting that empowerment, like you just add 2 letters and then it's somehow a lot more bearable than power on its own. And especially for female things, female empowerment it's more of a term than female power. And empowerment is like for yourself. It's about reclaiming something that was taken away. And like that is a little bit more socially acceptable. Whereas power is something outside of yourself, and it might be power over other people. And that is hard for society to get comfortable with. So if a woman has been through an absolute hellish time and struggled so much and had so much taken away, and then she kind of rebuilds and looks after her children, good for her that she's empowered to do that. Like that story we can deal with. But if it's a woman who, let's say it's a woman who doesn't want to have children and wants to be really powerful in the business world and boss people around, that's pretty uncomfortable for a lot of people. I mean, tell me if you think I'm unfair to say that.
No. I really agree, actually. And I was just really, when you were talking, you were saying power and in power. I was like, how does it feel when I think, feminine empowerment, and that feels like, that feels kind of softer and gentler. And then I think female power, and like the whole image I had was different in my mind. you know? And then I kind of,
Like ball break.
yeah. For some reason, I thought of Hillary Clinton for some reason. I don't know why, but I thought of Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, she famously lost a lot of points when she was asked about cooking, and she said, I don't bake. I'm not the chocolate chip baking kind of woman. And like, that was a huge problem. And it also could make me crave chocolate chip cookies as well, just thinking about it. But yeah, like female power, it sounds intimidating and like maybe a little castrating.
And I think, is that to do with, am I then tapping into my own psyche of like we're going to go back to my mother, aren't we? So it's like how, as I relate to my mother, and then I thought of, how I relate to my mother. So it's like, oh, my mother had power over me, right? For a good proportion of my life. Is that because I feel uncomfortable with that? But then I thought about male power, right? And truthfully, that makes me even feel even more uncomfortable, because really what I associate male power with is abuse, right? Even if I think of like politicians, like I think of power and I think of men in power, I think of Boris Johnson. For some reason, that's the first person that comes to my mind, and has done for a long time. I think of politicians and I think of people abusing their power for their own gain. But then when I think of male empowerment, there's a kind of gap. We don't really have and I've spoken about this before, we don't really have a movement for male empowerment. But when I do think of male empowerment, the only thing that comes to mind is kind of men going like powerfully leaving mental health issues behind them.
They need to be vulnerable and kind of
broken,
suffer enough. Yeah. So that then it's like, oh, but so they deserve to somehow be like nurtured enough to get a bit stronger, because they're not too intimidating and strong to begin with, or something along those lines. Like there's something about the brokenness. And it's so interesting that you think of abuse with male power. And I think, yeah, me too. And I think that, I mean, power is a really horrific thing a lot of the time. And it also, again, it's something we all want at different moments. And I think being honest and kind of interrogating yourself about it can be really helpful. So it can be such an act of kindness, if you are concerned about right and wrong, like actually kind of being able to explore the shadowy side of these things is an act of kindness. So if you feel like you want power in your family dynamics, or if you actually are wanting your boss's job, or you're wanting a power that feels ugly in some way, like open it up and look at what's there, and it can be really helpful for kind of sparing you acting out and doing something deeply unkind.
Mm-hmm. And I hear you say that, I think of like shadow work. You know, one of my teachers I worked with, he was really big on shadow work, and he's like, because ultimately, as you said, we want attention and we want power and we want all these things, but we suppress it and we shame ourselves for it. And then what we do, as you said, is it kind of comes out in other ways in our lives, because there's a desire for it and it's unconscious now. It's an unconscious desire or a conscious desire that we suppressed. And so then we act it out in ways that are actually harmful, because we're kind of like almost grabbing at opportunities unconsciously, instead of consciously looking at it and going, oh, I desire to have attention, so I'm going to consciously, I don't know, man, I'm going to like ask for a wonderful birthday party, or I'm going to ask for lots of people to attend a dinner for me. But because I feel shame about asking for attention, I'm going to, in some shadowy, secretive way, get attention by maybe gossiping about people and making other people look bad and things like that.
Or having a crisis creating chaos. There's so many ways people will set up a situation that is going to get them attention, but in the most indirect and maybe kind of burdensome way. So a big reason to acknowledge desires for whatever it is the kind of efficiency. Like rather than spend ages going around these things and having them come out sideways and stealing them or kind of going about them in deeply damaging ways. Like if you can kind of sit with it, then you can make congruent choices about it. I think freedom is another one that I want to say it's easier for men historically, not all, but men are allowed to value freedom a bit more than women. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but then like if you don't recognize that you want it, then you can wake up enraged with massive resentment and feel a desperation for freedom years later that kind of gets you into trouble.
Yeah. And I would say it's just the conditioning we receive as men is like men being free, even some of this the kind of age old stuff about men sowing their seed and stuff like that. It's this idea of a man should be free, should be like a wild dog. Yeah. And then I guess the kind of child rearing kind of speaks into that in that, a man is free, a woman has to look after children, so that means that her desire for freedom makes her an unsuitable mother, maybe even, or it kind of speaks into the independent woman movement and the disdain that you often feel that the media or certain parts of the media have for women who seek independence and power.
Yeah, totally. You're saying all the great trigger words. Yeah, I think it's so easy. We're all socially conditioned in different ways, but if we're not kind of thinking about it intentionally, you can almost sleepwalk into making choices that are automated, and then discover that actually you don't want a lot of the things that you have, and you want things that you haven't even considered. And I think it's also important to think about the fact that your desire will change in the future. Like whatever it is that you wanted, that glass of water earlier, and it's hard to see past the immediacy of a desire. So like 5 years from now, we're going to have deep desires for different things. The kind of particulars will be different. But I don't know about you. It can feel like there's a belief, and maybe like we're socialized not to think past this, but there's some kind of belief that whatever we want right now, we will keep on wanting.
Yeah. Actually, that's really beautiful. Well, depending who's experiencing that, but we sit with our desire of now of like, I want, for instance, I need to buy a car soon. In the next couple of weeks, I need to buy a new car. And I've noticed as I'm looking for a car, I had a desire for a car that looks nice or looks a certain way. And part of my brain is almost, I feel, is telling me, if you don't get the one you want, you will always regret it. You will always be dissatisfied with the choice you make, which is the kind of part of the coin of desire is the unfulfilled desire or the disappointment that can come. But actually, hearing what you said there, well, in 4 months' time, I might have the car, and the desire to have a nicer car may have just completely disappeared or superseded by something that's far more immediate or important.
Yeah, it's so distracting. And it's like we've tricked ourselves in a way into thinking, like we get seduced by desire and by kind of by our own marketing, but like there's that trickery aspect to it where like it's I'm thinking of it right now for a dress I want to buy, like the materialistic desires especially, like they feel somehow important and irreplaceable, like as though they will somehow do something for us.
Make our lives better in some way.
Whatever you get. Well, I'm in favor of having nice things if you want nice things, and it's possible. Like, no judgment about that, but it's the lack of perspective. I have to do perspective check-ins with myself like multiple times a day. I don't know how people kind of keep perspective. For me, I need to kind of regularly remind myself and shock myself because otherwise it just gets wonky really easily.
What is a perspective check for you? How do you do that?
Oh, a perspective check. In the small ways and the big ways, I really like the gold in the details. So I really like things like smelling. There's a rosemary bush on the street where I live, and when I walk by and I smelled rosemary, it's such an immediate and wonderful experience, and it's so uncomplicated, and it's nothing bigger than that. But I really just enjoy that. I don't love forced gratitude, so like I tend to have a bad attitude about gratitude, and if I'm told that I must be grateful or like must recognize other issues or situations, that brings out my own rebellion. So a perspective check-in for me is usually just being curious about my own existence, and that weirdly takes me away from my own existence. Like the self in all of it can be so kind of preoccupying that actually when you smell rosemary or you listen to someone else's story, like it's both about you but not about you. It kind of reminds you of the bigger world, and that's enough for me to just it may sound incredibly kind of almost idiotic as I'm saying it to you, like that I forget that there's a world outside of my own existence, but I do in some way. And I love being reminded of the vast world that we're part of.
So I guess the consuming nature of the desire for you, or the small I like to call it the small I, that little I that only really gives a fuck about me and what I want and how I want it to be, and would fucking, burn the world completely just for the small enjoyment of doing it in that moment without the thought of other people. And it's very easy to be consumed by that, to be consumed by what that part of us wants.
Especially if that little I is self-sacrificial and obedient to others, like, or people-pleasing. So it's not that the little I is always just like obviously selfish, because it can be in the name of I must do this and I'm beholden to that. Like for me anyway, like it tends to be the kind of my little I. I like that as a way of putting it, by the way. But it tends to be kind of so incredibly good to others in this unconvincing way of like I have to go do that and then do this, and not because I want to, but because I have to or should, like, but in this really self-pitying way.
I wanted.
So yes, I want to know about your little I, but yeah, go on.
No, I was going to ask about, because when you were talked about the rosemary bush, actually, the first thing I thought was, I was like, what does the rosemary bush remind you of? Is there something, what is it this, because I love the smell of rosemary as well, right? And actually, I'll tell my story. The reason I love the smell of rosemary is because I learned a recipe for cooking steak that was about, you fry the steak quickly and then you put it in the oven on a bed of rosemary. And it
Oh my gosh, you're making me hungry.
And it's amazing.
Yeah,
So whenever I
no.
smell rosemary, I'm reminded of the times where I would have had loads of time as well to like cook this steak in a particular way.
Yeah.
Would take like, it'd probably take an hour in total. And I'd buy this rosemary and it was quite a beautiful thing that I did. So whenever I smell rosemary, it's probably when I was making that particular steak, it's the first time I really appreciated the smell of rosemary in my life. And this was probably only 7 or 8 years ago. So whenever I smell rosemary, I'm reminded of the steak, the taste, and the whole preparation. And so I was wondering there with the rosemary just for yourself, is it that the desire to smell this rosemary for the enjoyment of it, is that connected to some past experience that's connected with rosemary?
I love that. I think that rosemary, I think smells are so associative, so difficult to describe as well. Like when people bring smell into therapy, it can be a kind of nonverbal thing. You might have stories or memories, and it can just be intensely personal, where it kind of threads together different moments from your life story. It's so kind of intimate as well. I just that reminder, and I think for me personally, rosemary roast chicken from my childhood. There is that personal element to it. It's also the fact that it's available because a neighbor has a rosemary bush. And so I think there's something about working with the Givens, like just kind of being in the context that you have found yourself in, and seeing what scraps are available, because there's always something. So Camus talked about how sometimes it was just a patch of blue sky that reminded him of possibility. And it might be pebbles, or discovering a beautiful work of art or culture or person. But like there's always something in your context that can be a reminder of maybe something from your past, but also something that you haven't yet experienced. I think there is something about that potential as well. Like we need the space of potential.
Yeah.
So I think the smell of rosemary probably reminds me of the past, but also maybe the promise of other joys to come. What about you? When you smell rosemary, do you then start imagining how you could make that steak dish again? And does it like awaken the possibility of wanting those things more?
It's interesting because now I'm thinking, because it's now I think of the rosemary and you talk about this rosemary. My mum has a rosemary bush as well at home in her garden, and I've used rosemary from her rosemary bush to cook my steak before. And now I moved back to the UK and I have all my pots and pans again. I could easily make the steak again. And now we're having this conversation. I'm like, yeah, I should make that soon, actually, because I really enjoy that.
I want to make it. I want to learn it now. See, this is what happens with desire also. If you're intentional about it, it can be awoke. Like there are things we can do if we're intentional to remind us of how wonderful life can be.
And I heard you say a word there, or you didn't say the word. Maybe you said the word evoking desire. Was that what you said?
I don't know. Maybe. Interesting. If I meant to say it or almost did, or you heard it. I think I said awoken, but I meant. But evoke works. Like you can enliven it. So, I kind of want for you to make that steak dinner.
Yeah. I'm gonna go. Yes, I will commit to that. I'm going to commit to making that steak in the next 4 weeks. I definitely do it. I do it before the baby comes. I do it the next 4 weeks. I'm going to commit to that. And when you said awoke, and I took that as evoke, it made me think of another side of desire, sexual desire in relationship. We kind of touched on that. And when we think of desire, we often think of sexual desire as one of the first places we go. And one of the things that happens in relationships is that the desire for sex disappears for people. And I think you touched on it earlier about the mismatch of being in a relationship and feeling that you should have sexual desire for your partner, and that not being there, and the sensation, and maybe you didn't say this at the time, of like shame or feeling like there's something wrong with us and so forth. And I work with men, so I come across a lot of men who are in relationship and they're not feeling sexual desire, and they feel like they're in somehow lesser of a man because they don't have a sexual desire, or there's something wrong with them.
Yeah, I loved the way you spoke about this on the panel that we were part of, because you were honest and just so real about it, and that, I think that must have had an impact for everyone there. It was really memorable, and I think that admitting what you want is hard, but admitting what you don't want is sometimes even harder. And it's so extraordinary that we don't admit that. I keep saying admit as though it's a court. That is probably my fantasy, but I wish we would all just be more honest about the fact that sexual desire can absolutely dry up at different moments in relationships with particular people. It really can. And dry up, it's like even the language, it's horrific. And it's not very flattering going either way. Like for a man, it's hard to acknowledge. For a woman, it's hard it's not sexy or attractive sounding or kind of nice. There's so many reasons it's difficult to talk about. It feels almost like a betrayal. It feels mean and unkind and rejecting to kind of not fancy the person you are committed to, and also it's not necessarily how you imagine yourself to be. So like we don't cooperate with what we commit to necessarily. But yeah, I think when you can lean into it and be accepting and be curious about it, desire comes in different forms. And it, again, like the fact that it's got this uncertainty to it is part of what makes it so wonderful, because it can also emerge in surprising ways, and you can have new discoveries, and it's not final. Whatever it is that you're desiring right now or not desiring it's not the end of the entire story. So yeah, people who don't want to have sex with a particular person at a particular time can feel like they will never want it again. That is, there's a kind of totalistic conclusion that often follows it. And also, I mean, I think for men, when they're on antidepressants or considering antidepressants, I feel like it's another area where it's difficult to talk about, and there should be more psychoeducation about these things, like because of the way medications can affect potency and ejaculation and all of those issues that, like, sure, it is important. It does matter if it matters to the person in question. But for all the talk about like how it's okay for men to get help for emotional problems, there's so many gaps, and it's another problem that it's not so easy for a man to talk about the sexual side effects of something like depression.
Yeah. I'm in a part of a company that runs men's groups. And it came up in one of the men's circles that we were running. There was a man who said, I have really sort of low libido and I've been on, is it SSRIs? I think he mentioned. And it's kind of a double whammy, isn't it? First, I'm admitting I'm on antidepressants. That's one thing. And I'm having sexual problems. It's like, it's not like 1 + 1 = 2. It's like 1 + 1 equals 11, and you've just, the people you're speaking to are suddenly like, oh man, I'm uncomfortable because we have, first of all, we're quite uncomfortable with mental health issues anyway. We don't know what to say. And then we're compounded with this, it's a sexual mental health issue. I've now overloaded when I've heard this information from someone else, and we all kind of just like mentally go inwards and maybe shut down with our own shame. And then we're unable to kind of support people, because it does feel like there's a desire for men to speak up, but if they speak up about something, there's usually a desire to be responded to in a way that feels appropriate. But when the thing they're speaking about is uncomfortable for people to hear, then the response can be incredibly flat.
Yeah, that, and like a flat response, like an impotent response to a disclosure of impotency. I mean, not easy at all. It's a really good point that you're making. Like, in a way that we give mixed messages still. Like, not only we're kind of not that I'm coming up with this, but all of us, like, there's a kind of push for people to talk more openly, but then actually it makes everyone uncomfortable. So where does that leave us? And the solution to one problem is then another problem. So, I mean, if that man in question was taking antidepressants and was no longer as depressed, he might then be very unhappy about the other issues that came from that. What was the response? What did the group do?
I think there was just some questions, because it's a sharing circle.
And then awkward.
No, I guess with the dynamic of the sharing circle, the men's circle, is that each man has a certain amount of time where he can talk without interruption, without anything. And at the end of it, there's a space for feedback. So that feedback can be a question, that feedback can be a reflection, or an observation, something like that. And I think with this particular man, I think it was an open circle. So it was only a space for questions. And there was just a question about, what he had tried or what he had thought about or what he thinks it may be. But you can always see, and this might be more synonymous of the issues that men have with talking to other men about sex, is there's an uncomfortability with just even hearing the information. And as I say that now, I'm thinking of, like, I did a panel talk with Lilo recently, and their whole thing was about the fact that, I don't know, almost 50% of men feel uncomfortable to talk about sex with their friends. So this is a kind of compound issue of multiple things. It's like man talking to man about mental health issue plus sex issue. There's like a lot of uncomfortability there.
Gosh, I feel for that guy. What would a good response have been?
That's an interesting question. What would a good response to that been? Because you don't want the response necessarily to be advice, because that can feel quite kind of belittling. I guess empathy. Like, wow, you described feeling like this, and I can imagine that feels difficult, or so forth. And then even certain questions can feel like advice, kind of sugar-coated. Have you tried X? Is like another way that feels belittling to someone who has had an issue. But it is a good point. Like, what would be an ideal response? I think for some people, maybe just people listening and just like being engaged. But it is a really good question in general for, like, all of the things that we feel uncomfortable about to say. and we want to say them out loud and want to say like, oh, I don't know what it is, the things we feel uncomfortable saying, and then we feel left disappointed by the response. It's like, it's an important question to ask ourselves, is like, what response would have been ideal for us?
Yeah, because that like vulnerability hangover is it's so hard as well, when like you've acknowledged something that was really difficult to say, and then it doesn't feel helpful. But, and then there's also that, there's such a dread of pity. There's such a big difference between empathy and pity. I am assuming that you would not want pity in that moment.
Exactly.
I don't mean you, although I might mean you. But yeah, and what about like other people identifying and just saying, yeah, me too. Like I've had that happen.
That could be helpful. That can be really helpful, I think, with these sorts of disclosures. Like I run a men's program often with groups of men, for taking them through like a 12-week program. And one of the things I like to introduce is, if someone's talking about something and you've had a similar experience, or you've had something like this happen to you, or you feel this way, we're all on Zoom. So you just raise a little hand, just like that. Just raise a little hand to just show like, this is something that I've been through, something I feel, like a resonance and empathy and understanding. And that has had, I've seen it happen in the moment where be incredibly transformational, because a man has talked about something that he thinks he's alone in. He thinks he's the only one experiencing. And he sees, 7 out of 10 hands go up. And I've seen men just completely stop talking, for maybe only for half a second, and then carry on. And at the end be like, wow, I didn't realize when I talked about that so many people would have experienced that, and so forth. So it is interesting in these moments, because I'm also thinking of times where the number of times we do disclose something, we express, we share, we're vulnerable. And then it's almost like we do it with the desire, back to desire again, the desire to then be disappointed and to prove ourselves right, that people can't support us or they can't be there for us in a particular way.
Yes, so much. I mean, it's that kind of trap, and it's really maddening to do and to be on the other side of as well. Like the way we want to confirm that people are shit. Oh, yeah. It's so important to be able to think about like how people can get it right, like what that might be like, and also then to be okay with embracing disappointment and being disappointing. But really interesting. I'm going to keep thinking about that man and that group.
Yeah. And you mentioned disappointment there. Is disappointment kind of intrinsically linked to desire? Yes.
I mean, desire and disappointment definitely go together. Is that disappointing?
No, I guess I'm thinking from a personal point of view is I feel like I have a real, not a problem with disappointment, is I hate to experience disappointment. And I think it comes from growing up and desiring things and not being able to have them, or not being able to get them. So I've I've kind of taught myself from this young age of like, don't desire things, don't want things, or don't express it outwardly, don't ask for things, because then I never have to experience the emotions of disappointment. Because I find that I experience disappointment quite intensely.
Yeah. You've put it so well, and that is such a good defense mechanism. To not let yourself want too much. I mean, that, and I've certainly been that way. That can keep us in the lamp also. Because it's dangerous to be exposed to this possibility of disappointment. And in a way you can live your life protecting yourself from wanting too much, And, like you can make sure, never write a book, never have children, never do anything, so that you can also have the fantasy that if you did do those things, they would be spectacular. I feel like that can be part of it, along with wanting to shield from disappointment. It's like you can preserve the fantasy of what could be without having to discover that you might do something that could be okay, but not great, or like that you would live to see the flaws.
This kind of keeps us in this, as you said, an illusion of a fantasy of illusion of almost like I could have been great, or I would have been great, but I didn't do those things.
Yeah. We all have the storage facility full of the kind of roads not taken. Well, I have tons of storage facilities with all those roads. And in a way, they're kind of treasures, because it could be the relationship that you unfortunately didn't get to pursue, or the missed opportunity, the thing that you didn't strive for, whatever it is. Like, it's kind of perfect because it's not real. It's not too real. It's the fantasy realm, and I think it can weirdly keep us from taking risks and kind of getting messy. So I do like to embrace disappointment or push for it. I'm pro disappointment and pro bitter.
Because you're pro risk.
Bitter gets. Yes, I guess I am, and I think bitter is like the one step worse than disappointment. Like, bitter is like the final destination of hell for the human condition. No one wants to go to bitter, and no one comes back from there either. If I'm gonna say, especially for women, like if she's bitter, like I don't know of recovery stories from bitter, and I really want to write about bitter, because I want to embrace it and find its beauty. Like, I don't think that it has to be a bad thing, but I definitely think we're freaked out by it.
Do you see any positivity in bitter?
Yes, I think that it's sometimes holding on to the truth, and like it's acknowledgement of something that happened and that hasn't been heard, hasn't been validated, hasn't been honored. And I think there's this little grain of hope in bitter. Like, anyone who's really actively bitter is still somehow hopeful for a different outcome. Because, like, there's a lot that goes into maintaining bitter. It's kind of a sense of what should have been, or a sense of ripoff. Like, that, on the other hand, is kind of suggesting that there's more that could be possible. So I think that you can get in there and do something with it. But I mean, I find very often in therapy and in my personal life, like, people deny bitter, like, as a rule of thumb, along with like envy. Like, I'm not envious. I'm not an envious person. I'm not bitter. Like, there's a kind of initial, and I'm totally one of them. I mean, someone in my family accused me of bitter in myself, and I just heard myself say, I'm not bitter about it. No, I'm not bitter. Like, it's really hard to admit to. But then when we do, it's quite exciting. How do you feel about bitter?
Yeah, I've never thought about it in the depth of which you just explained it. So, yeah, I guess I was trying to think of what would like 100% bitter be, because if
like confirmed bitterness.
Yeah, if whether there is no expectation of difference, is it like resignation?
I mean, I think that disappointment and bitterness and frustration all come together in interesting ways. Like, frustration is the energetic One, really, because like it's quite kind of active and ragey. Resentment is, and resentment. All of these I love all the negative emotions. Like I want to go there. I like resentment also, but I think bitter is like, yes, I think it is resigned, but it's still holding on to something. It's not entirely accepting because there's still that kind of that fury that's part of it. But if we could redirect that energy, there's something that's possible.
Because there's fury there, there's energy.
I think that the thing that is like actually the most terrifying is nothingness, is apathy. Like I prefer bitter to indifferent.
To change track a bit before we finish up, one of the things that I was wondering, and it comes to kind of desire, and in particular, I think I read somewhere you were talking about or writing about wanting to be desired. We talked about wanting to be desired, and I wondered, from your work and your experience, is there a difference between men wanting to be desired, maybe sexually desired or romantically desired, and women's wanting to be sexually or romantically desired? Because I talk a lot with men about this in their relationships, and it seems to me, and I don't want to put the answer for you, is that we don't really expect men to want to be desired. Whereas there's a more of an acceptance of women in relationships, especially in heterosexual relationships, of desiring to be desired.
Yes, you're so right. There's that French expression, that men want women to adore them, women want to watch the man adore them, so, like along those lines. But I mean, it's like there's a narcissism in the vanity of female desire that's maybe a little bit more acceptable as the object of desire than for men wanting it. I think men do want to be wanted, and I don't need to woman-splain that to you, do I? But I think it's hard to talk about, isn't it? Like it's another subtly stigmatized thing. Like along with male eating issues and the things that are that much harder for men, because it's also a feminized problem. It's like it feels kind of somehow wussy-ish if you're a guy and you're caring about that, and yet that just is so doubly difficult.
Yeah. Because I see this quite commonly with men in their relationships I talk to, and they're like, I've never felt I've had a lot of men say to me, it's like, I've never felt desired by a woman. Like no women I've ever been with, I felt desired. It always feels like I'm doing all the pursuing, I'm having to do the desiring, and I almost feel like I'm being a predator, and I don't want to be I don't want to be that guy, and I don't think I am that guy, but I'm having to always do the active part. So I've never known what it's felt like for a woman to desire me and want me, or to say the words and affirmations of desiring me.
Yeah. I mean, it's so inherent for all of us, I think, and beginning in childhood, and it often doesn't happen enough in childhood. I just feeling intrinsically worthwhile and valuable just for being you. It is a fantasy also that can't always be realized, but I think articulating it goes a long way. So, like, fair enough. Like, wanting to be deeply admired as well, like being adored, infatuated over or upon. Like, you can want all those things, and then, to use your favorite word, live with the disappointment that it's not going to necessarily play out that way every day of your life.
Okay.
But do the men who talk to you about wanting, I mean, do they admit that they want to be wanted, or do they just go as far as to say that they've never felt wanted?
When we're in conversation, it may be the first time that they've admitted that they want to be wanted. So it's from there, it becomes a case of like, how do I articulate this to my partner? And like, what does it, we have to kind of explore, like, what does it even look like for you? Because sometimes we want a thing, but we can't explain it to someone else so that it could actually fulfill on that desire for us.
Yeah. And what do they come away with for how they could explain it? I mean, do you have a suggestion of honesty and disclosure, or conversion to something more palatable?
I would.
Like, would you suggest to a man that he spell out to a woman how she can make him feel wanted?
I'll at least ask him to explore it for himself in his own mind, because I find, and we're kind of back to this disappointment of sometimes we talked about earlier, is we'll set people up in a way to create the disappointment we say we don't experience, or to feel let down. So if I say I want to be desired, but I can't tell you what it looks like for me to be desired, I can't explain it to you, I can't give you the details, then I say to my partner, hey, I want to feel desired, I want you to make me feel desired. And she may go, yeah, great, okay, I'll do that. And then she does something, and then we go, you see, I don't feel desired, you got it wrong. You don't.
Contrived.
Yeah.
Or it's like, you're only saying it because I told you to say it. So, yeah, it's sometimes the biggest relief to just kind of articulate it somewhere, and then realize it's not going to happen exactly that way.
And accept that, as you said. It feels. I had a conversation with someone on my last episode, and we came to. He felt that acceptance was such an important part of happy. You were talking about relationships, but such an important part. And it sounds like when we're coming to desires, acceptance is a really important part of both allowing ourselves to fulfill them, and both accepting that some of our desires will never be fulfilled. And that acceptance, it sounds like, is actually on both sides creates a fulfillment in our lives.
I totally, for just how transformative it can be to radically accept the desire in itself, and that it isn't going to happen. Like, to give up a dream. I'm in favor of giving up more easily, and I think we should be taught how to give up and like not stick it out with over committing to fantasies that won't happen. And also when you give something up and you realize that won't happen, you make space for a new dream. So it's not being downbeat in a general way, but like actually not being at the mercy of thinking something's going to happen that just simply won't. I got into a really awkward conversation with this facilitator at a discussion I did. She was, I mean, I'm going to sound like such an awful bitch, but she wanted me to tell her about desire and kind of said that she knows her desires. And I asked her if she would share any of the desires that she had. And she said, yes, that she wanted to be taller. And she began talking about how much better her life would be if she was taller. And then I said, but that's never going to happen. And she looked kind of crestfallen, and we didn't recover. Like it wasn't okay at all. And I injured her, and they're beyond repair. And for me, I thought it was a kind of act of kindness to just like work with the givens of it's so obvious to us that won't happen for her, but it was also like incredibly attacking and harsh. And I think we probably all have those longings where like there's some childish fantasy that actually thinks it's going to happen. And it's crushing and devastating to give up those darlings. But I guess I'm really murderous in those ways. Too far. How do you feel about, I want to know how you feel about the kind of sick and twisted things. Like if you ever get freaked out by desires that are just so unsightly when you hear about them.
No, I think that I read a number of books when I was probably about 10, 15 years ago about serial killers, the cases that haunt us. A friend of mine recommended, I think it's John Douglas. And it really opened my eyes to what we would normally see as, these are serial killers, people who maim people, who do all sorts of, I don't know how to describe them, but they would do things that we would see as monstrous and disgusting. And as he goes to, I've read a couple of his books, and I know he's spent a lot of time like interviewing serial killers and so forth. And I think what really struck me often was kind of how normal they were, the guys, because they're always men. Serial killers are pretty much like, 97% or something of them are men. And it's just that they had a desire to do something and experience something. And, whether that was, I always remember one, the guy would kill people, and I think he would cut their skin out at the back in the shape of wings. And,
oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I remember being like, okay, yeah, that's pretty, from our moralistic point of view, that's a pretty heinous thing. But I think when he interviewed this guy and he explained, he was like, oh, these are people, I can't remember if they were doing work that he saw as like, immoral. And he was giving them the gift of being able to
there was a coherence.
Yeah, like to be angels. And they would go off to heaven because of the work that he did. And I remember being like, wow, okay, so that was his desire. Then, obviously, acting out is problematic in our world. And most people couldn't even maybe read that. But I was able to kind of see that for him, there's some satisfaction in that. And actually, he seems that he was doing something that was good for the world.
It's incredible. The ways we are all self-deceptive and believe certain things and can see justifications for living the lives that we live. And there can be a fascinating coherence to even the weirdest sounding stories.
So I think we've run over time as well, and this has been for me
a serial killer.
I feel like I could have this conversation about desire, because it's such as we kind of think we said before we jumped on, it's such a broad topic, right? We can go from the desire to we could go from, we haven't even talked about kinks and things like that. We might want to like chain up our parents and so forth to get revenge, but it's also then the desire to like, have children or look after our children or to have my drink of water. It's this word, as you said, that's just kind of been hijacked, a bit like love. I think the word love's a bit like this, it's so broad that it's almost doesn't give us any detail until it's explained. But it's been a fascinating conversation for me because I've, gone through all these different areas of my own experience, but also what I see as what fuels us, fuels our lives, Yeah.
I love the way you've put that. And yes, I think you're right about the word love. It's also like love, desire is about the big things, big abstract values and the small details. It's both and you've really been kind of liberating to talk about it with, because you're so engaged and curious and open.
Oh, thank you.
Which is helpful for discussions about desire.
Thank you. And thank you to you for sharing all the wisdom and experience and the wonderful angles and made me think so much about something like desire that we've all thought a lot about desire, but there's just so many nuances and perspectives that, you know, we don't cover in daily life. And I imagine the listeners are
and secrets. I mean, it's always secretive.
And I imagine the listeners are wondering where they can hear more from you or work with you or hear you speaking anywhere.
Oh, my Instagram is somewhat up to date. I have events coming up. I'm working on my second book right now. I don't know about you. If you have a book that you're working on.
No, I don't. What is if you're allowed to share?
Yeah, it's about problematic, hurtful relationships and why we hold on to hurtful dynamics. Because one of the things I found I've written a book called What We Want, and one of the things I discovered was how often we want things that are hurtful and harmful and not necessarily good for us or anyone, but it's still really important. The self-destructive bit is significant in some way. So yes, I've been working on that. And I do have some events coming up, but I don't like talking about my book. Every time I say that, I feel like I sound unbearable. I can't stand the sound of that statement.
It's not unbearable at all.
Do you want to give my... That wasn't a kind of setup for reassurance, but thank you. Do you want to give my Instagram details in some way?
Yeah, you go for it. I can put them. I also put them in the show notes as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, you can find me on Instagram.
Wonderful. Thank you so much today, Charlotte, for this, and we're going over time as well.
Thank you so much. You were just so great to talk to. You're so expansive.
Thank you.
You listen well also.
Thank you very much. I want to say a big thank you for listening. You know, it's people like yourself that really help get the podcast out into the world. You know, especially if you're often sharing the episodes and the podcast with people that you feel just could do with listening, right? Can see a different way of being a man, maybe a different way of having dating lives and intimacy and relationships. So I want to say a big thank you. And if maybe after listening to this episode, you think, oh, there's someone actually who could really do with this, please share it with them. You know, share the love. I'm really, really grateful. And if, you know, you want to get in contact with me for any questions, or you want to talk about coaching or any working together, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram @theauthenticman_, or you can email me hello@theauthenticman.net. Thank you very much.